So which are the bugs to fear, and which ones might not be quite as dangerous as they look? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're talking Tyranid units, and we're going to be going through a bit of a tier list, starting with the bugs that I think are weakest in Codex Tyranids right now, and moving through to the strongest. With brand new synaptic link abilities and a powerful new Leviathan supplement coming out recently, it does seem that the Tyranid list might be hitting tournament tables with a bit more ferocity than they were before. With that in mind, I've been through each choice in Codex Tyranids, arranged them into 4 different tiers, and we'll go through each of them in turn, talking about maybe a couple of strengths and weaknesses, and why I've chosen to rank them as I did. Obviously, I always say this, but tier lists are a touch arbitrary. Often some of the more niche units can be pretty good for certain battlefield roles, and it's mainly a bit of an overview to provoke some discussion. If you think that I've got anything too majorly wrong, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. I'll post a pinned correction comment as to if I think that I've got any of the units wrong, and been better informed by your guys' feedback. In any case, let's jump straight into it. We'll start with tier 4 the lowest, and move forward to tier 1 the best. So first up in tier 4 I've chosen just to rank the 1 unit, which I do feel unfortunately is solidly below the rest of the units in the list, and I'd argue a bad idea to take competitively in any way. That unit is the Tyranid Fortification, the Spore Assist, the one that can drop down from deep strike, has some wildly inaccurate bioweapon fire, and might chuck out a few spore mines. It costs a fair bit for what you get in my opinion. It only ever hits on 5, so isn't going to be hitting that much, and it's incredibly susceptible to modifiers if your target happens to have any dense cover. When it's down, it's kind of an immobile liability that your opponent might be able to hide in combat with if they need to, and you might have very limited choice of where you actually set it up due to the fortification deployment rules in 9th. As per a big rulebook FAQ, fortifications can't go anywhere within 3 inches of other bits of terrain, so you might have very limited spots on the battlefield where you can drop it. I feel that in general you're going to be better off with other units. Next up we have tier 3, units that I think are quite niche and I'd rarely expect to see play in competitive NID lists. First up we have the Spore Mines and the Mucilid Spore. They're really quite cheap throwaway units that you can use to block a bit of movement, but they do die to a stiff breeze. They're kind of unlikely to get any damage off due to their pretty slow movement, and when that damage does go off, it's a touch underwhelming for how many points you pay. I think they're still kind of interesting for a bit of area denial and screening out units, but that's something that quite a lot of Tyranid Codex units do quite well, and things like Ripper Swarms, Gargoyles or Lictors might be a better choice for that. The Red Terror is the Ravener character, who I'd see as an optional upgrade if you do want to boost their melee damage a touch. It gives an aura of +1 to hit in melee for them, which can be useful. It's pretty cheap as a throwaway threat, though with a depressing 0 AP on its combat weapons, it's not going to be doing too much in combat to anything significant. As kind of an optional upgrade for a unit that isn't really the best damage dealer in the first place, I wouldn't be taking him competitively too often. Next we have the swooping Tyranid Air Force in the Harpy and the Hive Crone, and these guys, like the vast majority of flyers in 40k, just perhaps don't do quite enough damage to make themselves meaningful. Hitting on 4s really doesn't help these two, and probably their biggest asset is being able to move really quite a big 30 inches and still make a charge to tie up some enemies. With only 12 wounds and a 4+ save and no -1 to hit though, they're really not that tough to kill for the 150 odd points that you'd be spending, and if they do mix it up in melee, the damage output isn't great either, killing an average of around about 1 Space Marine per turn. These guys just need to do a bit more damage for the 155 points. Next up we come to the Tyrannicide, the Tyranid Drop Pod. Drops down, vomits out a horde or a monster, and from then on is a floating nuisance unit, like the Spore Assist, firing out some fairly inaccurate attacks with its side-mounted weapons. I guess it isn't the worst option if you absolutely have to deep strike a monster, but I feel like its points cost to the ratio of how much it's going to be transporting is going to be a bit off, and if you were thinking about transporting hordes of little guys, I think usually you're going to be better off with Lictor Pheromone Trails or Trigons. Maybe some niche uses though, can certainly be an annoyance unit once it's down. Next we have the Toxicrine, which largely in terms of damage and durability seems to be a little bit inferior to Carnifexes in my mind, though it is quite nice that the damage output is fairly general, being able to re-roll wound rolls with those toxic lashes. I'd say perhaps the most interesting thing about this critter is that it has its Grasping Tendril stratagem, which does give you a potentially powerful option to pin an enemy unit in combat, having more chance if it's infantry. If this thing does manage to get a charge off on something that doesn't want to be charged, it's going to be bad news, and kind of forces your opponent to have to try and deal with it in melee. Still though, I'd say perhaps not top of the pack in terms of monster damage dealing. Next up we have the Pyrovore, which I could have happily put in either tier 2 or tier 3 to be honest. For its 28 points, I'd argue that the damage of a single heavy flamer is pretty underwhelming. Durability is maybe okay, just with the sheer amount of wounds on the table, but really what could make this guy a little bit more competitive is that he's really quite cheap infantry, so useful for actions. If you could use one or two of these to do things like retrieve Octavius data, and then go on to be a little bit of an anti-infantry threat after that, then he's kind of done his job for 28 points, and to be honest, in hindsight I probably should have moved him up to tier 2 instead. Next up we come to the Tyrant Guard, the ones that can absorb fire for nearby Hive Tyrants, and hopefully have them not shot off the table quite as early. I feel like the idea of these is kind of nice. It's definitely a problem for Hive Tyrants having greater than 9 wounds being able to be targeted directly, but in general I'd say that these guys are just a touch on the slow side and won't be able to keep up with the Winged Hive Tyrant, which is the one that more people tend to run. They're kind of okay defensively, the damage output's fairly underwhelming I think, and I don't think that these guys will be run all that often in competitive lists. Next up we have the Venomthropes, and their -1 to hit bubble that can make nearby Tyranids a little bit harder to shift. There are a few caveats, including that you need the full 3 of them at least to cover any monsters, and perhaps one of the main weaknesses is that the Venomthropes themselves aren't really all that hard to gun down for the points, even with a -1 to hit. So I think you typically need to do something clever like keep the Venomthropes themselves hidden out of line of sight, while hopefully still having the rest of your critters within buff range. Otherwise their damage output just isn't particularly impressive, and I think in general people tend to prefer just bringing more bugs in the first place, rather than trying to prevent casualties with these. They're definitely not useless, just a little bit niche. Against certain armies, say if you knew that you were playing a ballistic skill 4+ shooting army, they could certainly be worth it. I think they're perhaps just a little bit overpointed though to see regular play in competitive Tyranid lists. Finally for tier 3 we have the Death Leaper, the special character Lictor, who to be honest just really is inferior for the points invested. He's getting on for almost twice the price as a regular Lictor, and I just don't think that the buffs that he brings are really worth it compared with them. The -2 to hit was the main way of keeping him survivable back in 8th, but now modifiers are capped at -1, so that's not quite as effective, and I think pretty much all the time you're just better off bringing 2 individual Lictors rather than Death Leaper and his special rules. Moving on, and we're starting to get into the more threatening bugs now. Here we have tier 2, and more interesting units that see perhaps a little bit more play in Tyranid list, though perhaps aren't quite at the top of the tree for the Great Devourer's units. First up we have the Hive Tyrant, which I must admit I struggle to rank. I could pretty much equally happily put him in tier 1 or tier 2. As the linchpin of the Tyranid army, being fast, a decent HQ choice, and providing some psychic, I think really quite a lot of Tyranid lists will tend to run him, usually with wings, and he does have quite a lot of customization options whether you want to build a more melee focused monster, or one that's going to wing around providing buffs and unleashing hails of fire. My main issue with the Hive Tyrant is that he's at least fairly fragile for the points cost. Only 12 wounds, usually for 185 or more points. It just really isn't all that much, even when it's backed up by a 4+ invul. Certainly a lot of Tyranid lists do run him, but I sort of feel like it might be partly out of necessity, and it wouldn't really do him all that much harm to come down a few points. I'd say definitely a model that needs to be hidden pretty well, unless you just want your pricey warlord gunned off the table by a bunch of autocannon shots and bolt fire. Still though, certainly one of the best units in tier 2, if not a candidate for tier 1 just because of how much use he is. Next up we have the Tyranid Prime, the cheapest Tyranid HQ in the book, and I think he does have a niche if all you're looking for is a cheap HQ to fill a detachment slot, and particularly if you're trying to field Tyranid warriors as damage dealers. His +1 to hit for nearby warrior squads is pretty good for 75 points, and he does have a bit of his own melee threat. In general, I'd argue either the Neurothrope or the Broodlord might be the better choices for cheap HQs if you're willing to spend a few more points, but at base 75 this guy is the cheapest option for filling a detachment if you need it, and sometimes that's going to be the best option. Next up we have Hormagaunts, possibly another one that might have been a candidate for tier 1. These guys do see a fair amount of fairly common play, being the cheap melee swarm Tyranids, and perhaps one of the better choices for a unit that you just want to bound forward onto the midfield objectives, maybe do a bit of screening, and try and clear a little bit of enemy chaff. They're really quite fast with their 8-inch move, and their bounding leap can allow them to gain really quite a lot of movement in the fight phase as well, with 6-inch paladins and consolidates being quite good for getting into contact with other units that don't want to be, or swinging onto objectives. Quite a nice all-round utility troops choice, but maybe lacking in some of the sheer damage or durability compared with the others. Gargoyles feel like swarms in a pretty similar vein as well. You get a little bit more movement and fly for the extra point that you increase, and the ability to deep strike for free if needed. They don't have quite as much threat as the Hormagaunts or Termagants can muster though, and they lack Obsec unlike those other 2 choices. Still though, they're yet another cheap and effective option for screening and doing actions and things. Not really something that the Tyranids lack, but might be the right choice in certain lists. Next up we have the Carnifexes. I'd rate them as kind of mid-tier assault monsters at the moment, and perhaps one of the best things about them is their sheer amount of flexibility, being able to customize them for different roles. You could have them hitting on 3s with barrages of Devourers with Brain Leech Worms, or amp up their survivability with some Spore Cysts for inbuilt -1 to hit. With a relatively slow movement though, and not really the stats to back up a battle line unit in 9th edition, they don't tend to be taken really all that much. But out of the Tyranid monsters creatures, it is quite nice to have such a flexible datasheet, and the option to use the variant ones such as Screamer Killers or Thornbacks if you desire. Next up we have one of the biggest in Codex bugs in the Tyranids, maybe made a little bit more interesting with things like those synaptic link abilities. Could be one of the more interesting ones to put things like +1 to hit on, or some of the other buffs. Again, in general, perhaps a little bit expensive for what they do. They can put out a fairly hefty amount of either anti-infantry or anti-tank fire though needing to remain stationary to fire at full effect isn't the best, and maybe similar to Carnifexes, kind of struggle to outcompete the other Tyranid damage dealers. At least it's reasonably tough to shift though with 14 wounds and toughness 8. Next up we come to the Tervigon, a choice that's actually been made quite a lot more interesting by the Synaptic Link ability, as in that new expansion they can now grant out really quite a powerful shooting buff, allowing you to reroll 1s or 2s to wound. Provided you're not wounding on 2s anyway, it makes this thing really quite a decent buffing machine, let alone the other few things that it does. I still think that they might be a struggle to make work, but they do have the potential to contribute value on a fair few fronts. They can respawn termagants from big squads, provide a little bit of psychic support, provide that shooting buff, and they do have kind of okay defense, particularly if you buff it with a 5+ invul save from Adaptive Physiology. Next up we have the Morlock, the terror from the deep that can burrow up extra close to enemy units and cause a bunch of damage. The mortal wounds aren't really going to be enough to justify it being included. Its best value maybe comes from move blocking key enemy units, and basically giving them a 12 wound monster to deal with that's right on their doorstep and hopefully ignore your other threats. Still though, I think 125 points is pretty expensive for that, and again will struggle to compete against some of the top tier choices. Next up we have the Auspex, which I'd kind of see as a sort of variant of the Carnifex really. Fairly tough to shift at toughness 8 and 13 wounds, and is basically an anti-infantry machine with its Ravenous Maw gaining extra attacks for any enemy infantry models slain. I'd say its durability is okay, and its damage output is alright against infantry models. It can potentially go up to quite good though if you spend a couple of command points. You can be re-rolling all hits and wounds with this thing for 2 CP. In general I'd rank it as just okay. Rarely going to be any sort of strong competitive choice, but against the right targets with a couple of command points can suddenly become surprisingly dangerous. Next we have the Biovore, the Tyranid artillery piece that is certainly playing second fiddle to the Hive Guard right now, and perhaps the most interesting thing about it is that when it misses it gets to place a Spore Bind somewhere down next to the enemy unit, something that might genuinely have a bit more value than the actual damage output itself, being able to screen out enemy units or move block them. Otherwise, if you don't have any good targets to move block, you could try and just snipe down the last few wounds if there's something that's crucial that's almost dead. But if you want actual damage output, then the Hive Guard with the Impaler cannons are just so much better. Next up we have the Zoanthropes, the Psychic Nids with their 3+ invul save, and their boosted smite if they turn up in large numbers. 3+ invul saves really are quite rare in 40k these days. It does mean that they can laugh off quite a lot of high strength, high damage shots, and can potentially command reroll high value saves to very good effect. If you take 4 of them for 200 points, then you're usually going to be spitting out at least 4 mortal wounds a turn in addition to another power, and the Zoanthropes do have one of the better Synaptic Link abilities, a 10.1 to allow you much more reliable casting. They could either give that to their own unit, or maybe something like the Swarm Lord or Hive Tyrant trying to get off important powers like Catalyst. If you just want to get raw powers on the board though, then Neurothropes are going to be cheaper per cast, and I think in general most people would be taking the Neurothrope over these. It's perhaps a similar story for the Maleceptor, the big bad Tyranid Psychobug. This guy's 170 points and has a 4+ invul save, gets 2 casts and an interesting Psychic Overload ability where he can trade out his psychic powers to mortal wounds to people nearby. Quite interesting that he does have a little bit of melee threat as well. Strength 7 and damage d6 could certainly put a bit of hurt on enemy heavies, but again if you just want raw psychic power in the army, he doesn't really outcompete the Neurothrope. Again, with the new book, maybe one of the most interesting reasons to take him is his newest Synaptic Link ability. That one's a fairly decent shooting buff, allowing you to re-roll damage results and gets extra AP on rolls of 6. If you are bringing one along, that one does seem sensible to pick up. Next we have the Trigon and the Trigon Prime. Very similar in abilities. For the extra 25 points, the Prime gets to be a Synapse creature and gets a bit more of a shooting attack from its bioelectric pulses. These guys are kind of okay as a deep strike monster threat. 6 attacks hitting on 3s with damage d6 will certainly put some hurt into something, but perhaps one of the main reasons that you'd actually want to take them is their Subterranean Assault special rule, allowing you to give a free deep strike to some other Tyranid unit, maybe a bunch of Termagants with Devourers or something. Can be quite a nice way to deliver those, as it can get them just outside 9-inch range and guarantee that all of their guns are going to be shooting the enemy. Next we have the Tyranid Raveners, yet another example of a cheap, fast, deep striking Tyranid infantry unit, not particularly tough to take out, and once they're down they can move very fast across the battlefield with 12 inches move. Again, could be an interesting option for screening objectives, actions, and skirmishing with light infantry, though as we have already seen there's really quite a lot in that category, Hormigants, Gargoyles, Lictors and Genestealers being among them. They don't seem too bad, but maybe not too stand out either. Finally, for my Tier 2 unit, we come to Old One-Eye, the character Carnifex that gives +1 to hit for other nearby Carnifex units. It's quite nice that it's 9 wounds, so it can't be directly targeted, and he has the choice between monstrous crushing claws or monstrous scything talons, depending on what he most wants to strike. He is a bit on the pricey side, but it's quite nice to have such a massive melee threat that you can character screen. Certainly his presence in the battle line is going to make your opponent think twice about charging your outlying units. Finally, we come to Tier 1, where I've ranked what I consider the strongest Tyranid units right now. I think the majority of the strongest Tyranid lists will be including a bunch of units from this selection. First up, we have the Humble Ripper Swarm, perhaps one of the ultimate Tyranid screening units. These swarms are just very cheap and tough OBSEC troops, with a built-in deep strike to boot. I think a unit or two of these in a Tyranid army is almost never going to be a bad decision. Piling 9 wounds onto an objective for just 36 points is very nice. They have the potential to screen or tie up units for a turn, and might even be able to claim the life of a light infantry model or two, as they do have a flurry of strength 3 attacks, even if they do hit on 5s. Just for holding down and tying up objectives for a very cheap points cost, they do remain one of the strongest Tyranid units for winning the objective game. From the least impressive bugs to the apex predator, we have the Swarm Lord, who has basically been a staple in every second Tyranid competitive list this whole edition, mainly because of his absolutely amazing double move ability, allowing him to fire Tyranid units around the board for some very easy turn 1 charges. This works great on just about anything, firing Kraken Genestealers up the board to be able to charge onto the enemy's backline turn 1 if they want to, running up big monsters such as Dimacarons or Hierodules, or even just giving himself a surge and getting him into melee. He also comes with a couple of psychic powers and pretty decent melee stats in his own right, and on top of that he even got a pretty decent points drop in the latest balance pass. The biggest weakness is similar to the Hive Tyrant whenever he can be directly targeted. He's not really all that tough to gun down for the cost, but still he's a pretty invaluable asset to have at the heart of the swarm. Next up we have the Genestealers, super fast running Tyranid living missiles that with their rending claws they have the number of attacks and the AP to be able to deal with really quite a good range of targets. As already mentioned in Hive Fleet Kraken, they can have a crazily long threat range, and as they can come in some pretty meaty squad sizes, they can be a good choice for receiving certain buffs. I feel like we might start to see a fair few Leviathan Genestealers played. One of their Warlord traits allows you to reroll all hit rolls with them, and can make pretty good use from some of the synaptic link things, such as the cover one from the Broodlord. Like the Swarm Lord, they also came down in points a bit in the latest chapter approved, and they're still looking like one of the better options in terms of Tyranid swarm damage dealers. Next we have one of the scariest units in the Tyranid Codex in the Hive Guard, and are perhaps just a little bit oppressive on the other choices, with their shooting just being so much better than a lot of the rest that's on offer. Taking their Impaler cannons for 45 points per model, you get a decent rate of fire of strength 8, AP -2 and damage D3 shots, and all of those shots don't need line of sight, and they also ignore cover as well. Pretty much literally anything that gets hit by them is going to feel it pretty hard, and they can target whatever they want. A unit of 5 or 6 of these, double shooting with single-minded annihilation, is perhaps one of the easiest choices to include in the entire Tyranid Codex. Fire them out of line of sight in a bottom floor ruin, and give your opponent an annoying headache of a unit to deal with. Again, they're perhaps even better with the other Tyranid buffs. With Synaptic Link they can get a +1 to hit really easily, and that Leviathan Warlord trait again can allow them to reroll all hits. Basically one of the best Tyranid shooting choices, just got even more brutally deadly. Moving on, we come to the Exocrine, a slightly different flavour of shooting damage from the Hive Guard, but still very good general purpose efficient firepower. For 170 points, it's fairly tough for the points, toughness 8 is pretty handy, and puts out enough damage to make it worth it. Its bioplasmic cannon can be fired twice if it's stationary, and if you really need it you can upgrade it to damage 3 with pathogenic slime if you happen to be firing against 3 wound infantry or something. It's quite nice that it's got a nice 1 command point stratagem as well called Symbiotic Devastation, which allows you to move and still double tap, or even fall back and double shoot, as per one of the latest FAQs. Really quite nice to have on a gun beast like this. Next up, and completing our tour of the Tyranid shooting phase, we have the Termagants, and the little guys can be really quite good use either just from very cheap Auspex swarms, or to be used as primary damage dealers with their Devourers, which they're really quite cheap to field. At 5 points each, and fearless within synapse range, they can be pretty good for taking objectives, cannon fodder troops that you don't really care if you lose all that much, and quite good units for screening. Or if you do go in for the Devourer strategy, and maybe deep strike them next to an enemy, perhaps with a Trigon, a full squad of 30 with a Devourers cost 210 points, and again multiplied up to 180 potentially by firing twice. They can certainly get other buffs as well from that. We've already mentioned plenty of the good stuff that you can get from High Fleet Leviathan or the Synaptic Links. Almost anything is going to wither when it's subjected to just quite that much volume fire. Going back to the HQ section, and we come to the Broodlord, which I'd say is perhaps one of the best general purpose standard sized Tyranid HQs. A nice fast infantry character who brings a little bit of psychic to the table and also a decent melee threat in his own right. Again, I'd say that the Synaptic Links are improved him even more. A 15-point upgrade can allow him to generate some light cover or dense cover for nearby units, and it's really quite powerful to be able to just stack an extra defensive buff on the Tyranid unit that you think needs it most. Most certainly a staple of a lot of Tyranid competitive lists, and I don't think is going to be going anywhere anytime soon. Next we have the Tyranid Warriors, again brought to even more significance by the Synaptic Links, but already they're fairly decent general purpose troops. 17 points for 3 toughness 4 wounds on the table isn't too bad, and again they can skirmish pretty well with light infantry if they get close. I had already seen a few competitive lists that were running these guys as a bit of a battle line. Just for their basic loadout, their damage and durability does seem okay. With a Synaptic Link added to that though for 15 points to hand out a +1 to hit for any Tyranid unit, I feel like one unit is almost an auto-include in Tyranid lists now. They could theoretically use it to buff themselves and have them hitting on 2s in combat, though I think in reality it's usually going to make more sense to soup up another unit, perhaps have a unit of Gene Stealers hitting on 2s before you missile them off to charge the enemy, or just buff the shooting of something like Hive Guard or an Exocrine. If they can do that while even just standing around capping a home field objective, then they'll have done their job. Next we have the 37-point Lictor, yet another Tyranid deep strike harassment and annoyance unit, and maybe one of the best choices for doing certain actions like retrieve Octarius data. It seems to be quite a common choice just to plop these guys down in a table quarter to score a few secondary points, and then maybe venture off to annoy enemy infantry units after that. I quite like the potential they have with Pheromone Trail as well to unleash another infantry unit nearby. They could be another option for unleashing some Termagants packed full with Devourers. Finally, from the main Tyranid Codex we have the Neurothropes, a really nice choice for a cheap HQ to fill a detachment slot and bring 2 Tyranid powers to the table. They'll definitely have more value if you aren't running too many other psychic bugs, as the psychic powers do tend to have diminishing returns once you've taken the good ones. But if all you want out of your HQ is efficient psychic, then these guys are the ones to go for. 50 points per cast of a power, and they also get to reroll ones to cast them as well, making them incredibly reliable. And finally for the review, although we have largely been keeping it to the Codex Tyranids, I thought we'd at least just mention a few of the more notable Forge World choices you can take. Maybe the biggest and baddest right now are the Dimacaron, Barbed Hierodule and the Harridan. The Dimacaron is the enormous fast attack monster that can go bounding over buildings and enemy units to get into combat. Was an absolute staple of the top Tyranid list for a while, but did receive a bit of a nerf in the last chapter approved. I do still think he remains one of the better frontline damage dealing monsters. A big 18 wounds critter with a 12-inch movement, a built-in 5+ invul save, damage D3+3 melee, and the chance to deal a few fun mortal wounds with its thorax spine maw and get a feel no pain type save if he does kill anything. The Hierodules are maybe a bit more significant now the Dimacaron's been toned down a bit. I've managed to mix them up a bit on the slides here. I'm a bit more convinced by the Scythed Hierodule than the Barbed one. It's only 235 points, has a pretty powerful flamer attack for clearing infantry, and a bunch of strength 10 damage D3+3 attacks in combat. Finally, the Harridan is pretty much the apex predator of an all-in Tyranid monstrous creature. I remember someone managed to use one to win a grand tournament earlier in the year. A crazy 700 point enormous Tyranid flyer with 34 wounds it can be really quite hard to shift with some adaptive physiology for a 5+ invul, and then some enormous dire biocannons which should be able to put some hurt on the exact thing that you need to kill the most. A lot of armies just aren't going to be able to bring down the Harridan efficiently, and have the choice of either allowing it to eat large chunks of their army, or risk wasting all their damage against it if they manage to injure it but not kill it. In general, these really big critters tend to be quite good for any Tyranid buffs that you can put on them, either their adaptive physiologies, or any of the fairly powerful Tyranid stratagems that you can use on them to buff their damage. So I think that just about brings us to the end of our tier list for Codex Tyranids. Please let me know what you think down in the comments below, any experience with or against the strongest units on the list, and if you think that any are misranked at all. If there's any that I really think I should have ranked differently, I'll try and post any corrections in a pinned comment down below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly be keeping the 40k videos coming, new tactics and game content out most days, and hopefully a bit more for the Tyranids in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just quickly like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find links down in the video description. Making all the videos does take a fair amount of time, particularly big tier list ones like this, and if you are enjoying regularly, then any support keeping them coming is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.